Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of CUSP and FDSD to the latest in the Nature of Prosperity dialogues. For those of you with sharp eyes, you've probably noticed that I'm not Tim Jackson. My name's Graham Smith. I'm the chair of the Foundation for Democracy and Sustainable Development, who are working with CUSP on this event. So those who don't know, CUSP is an ESRC funded centre led by Tim Jackson, which looks into the question of what prosperity might mean in a world of environmental, social and economic limits. The Foundation for Democracy is a London-based charity that explores and helps build relationships between flourishing democracy and sustainable development. It focuses on research, advocacy and dialogue, and tries to develop tools and tactics to equip people, organisations and governments to better think, plan and act for the long term. Today is the latest of the dialogues with Rowan Williams, but it's also a broader theme today. So we're going to start off with a dialogue, but later in the afternoon we'll be looking at nature writing and the common good, which is a CUSP initiative where unpublished pieces have been put forward, and they will be discussed by Kate Oakley and Ian Christie, Louise Joa Parker, and Madeline Bunting and Jessica Lee. That will be happening in the afternoon, and I'll say more about that towards the end of this session. But this morning's dialogue is focusing on the question of becoming a good ancestor. How can we reframe democracy for tomorrow? For many of us, democracy has failed to deliver on long-term policy. It's failed in relation to climate change. It's failed in relation to health and social care. It's failed in relation to emerging technologies and in long-term education, and more recently with the COVID-19 pandemic. So what are the drivers of short-termism? Why is it that democracy finds it hard to deal with the long term? And can democratic institutions be recrafted to deliver for current and future generations? So today we bring together three writers and activists who have produced books in the last in the last year, which begin to answer those questions. The first of our panelists is Rowan Krznaric. He's a public philosopher who writes about the power of ideas to change society. His many books include Empathy, which led to the wonderful, the world's first empathy museum. His book, and I'm going to hold up, is The Good Ancestor: How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. You might have noticed we've stolen the title of this session from his work, which he tells me he stole from somebody else, so he might explain that later. The second panelist is Jane Davidson, who is Pro Vice Chancellor Emeritus at the University of Wales, Trinity St David, and she likes to tell everyone a smallholder. Between 2000 and 2011, she was a minister in Welsh Government, where she proposed and took through the world's first Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015, sorry, how can I forget the dates? She is author of Future Generations, Lessons from a Small Country. And our third panelist is Rebecca Willis. Rebecca has been a researcher for over 20 years working on environment and sustainability policy and practice. She's professor in practice at Lancaster University and established Green Alliance's Climate Leadership Programme, which helps train MPs around climate change. And she was expert lead for the recent Citizens' Assembly on the UK. Her book, Too Hot to Handle: The Democratic Challenge of Climate Change, was also published this year. And most importantly, yesterday, she was announced as one of the 30 Women's Hour, one of the top 30 women in the Women's Hour Power List, Our Planet. Our dialogue is led as ever by Dr. Rowan Williams, Master of Magdalen College at Cambridge University, and Archbishop of Canterbury, and importantly, Wales as well. He's published widely on aspects of Christian spirituality, theology, history, and politics, and is a noted poet and translator of poetry. So Rowan, it's an absolute delight to hand over to you and to think about how we might reframe democracy for tomorrow.
Thank you very much indeed, Graham. And it's a huge pleasure and privilege to be with such a wonderful group of panelists. Welcome all those others who are joining us for this discussion. These discussions over the last couple of years have been, for me, certainly a hugely enriching and stretching experience, focusing our minds on the large questions that are very often parked in the too difficult lot. So what we're hoping to do today is dust off those things that look too difficult, those things that look too general or too large, because only by that difficult combination of focusing on the very particular and keeping the vision very broad are we going to find the energy, the imaginative energy to cope with where we are, balance to the work that they've done. They've brought that balance in that they have, all of them, focused precisely on those local, those specific issues. They've done that through narrative exploration and reflection, and they've done it in the context of a broad and generous vision. So what I'm going to do is to invite each of them in turn to say a few words about the books that they've published lately, so that we can see what kind of contribution they're putting into the bloodstream here. And after that, we'll have a conversation for a bit longer and then open this out for wider discussion. And we're going to start with Rowan, who's published, as we've heard, a book on being a good ancestor. And I'll hand over to you to tell us a bit about what that might entail in your view. Rowan.
Sure. This is a book really about legacy. The legacies that we're going to leave to the billions upon billions of people who will inhabit the future, and also the legacies we've inherited from the past and what we can learn from that. And Rowan, you mentioned about what we're going to kind of inject into people's bloodstreams in a way, and that's really a good way of thinking about the question of legacy, because the person who's really inspired me on the topic of being a good ancestor is the immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s. And when he was famously asked who held the patent for the polio vaccine, he said, well, there is no patent. You know, could you patent the sun? Quite surely a question that's relevant today with all the new vaccines coming out for COVID-19. But, you know, Salk was very much interested in leaving a positive legacy for humanity, thinking very long term. And later in the life, in the 1970s, he said the great question facing society is, are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by the generations to come? And he believed that if we were going to be remembered well and tackle the great challenges of our time, from the nuclear threat to our destruction of the living world, we need to expand our time horizons. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and millennia. And that's the kind of challenge that he put to us. And we know that challenge matters for us today because we live in an age of the tyranny of the now, where our politicians can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet. Our businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, and we're constantly clicking the buy now button. And this matters for all those questions that, or issues that Graham mentioned in the introduction. How do we tackle the climate crisis? How do we deal with threats from technology like AI? How do we do long-term investment in education and healthcare and try and deal with the intergenerational injustices that get passed on through time, rooted in slavery and colonialism and racism? So that's really what I've been trying to tackle in this book. How do we deal with both the positive legacies of the past and learn from them, the discoveries of the great, medical insights from people like Salk? How do we deal with the negative legacies we've inherited, those legacies of slavery and colonialism that are written into public institutions, the legacies of economies which are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth, and then think about passing on a kind of like an intergenerational golden rule. Instead of just do unto others as you'd have them do unto you in today's world, let's do it through the generations. Let's treat future generations how we would have wanted to be treated by past generations. And that really sets my book off on how do we think long term. And let me say one more thing, is that I think one of the great challenges is how do we inject long-term thinking into the DNA of democracy itself? I dwell on that a lot in my book, and I know Rebecca and Jane have both spoken about that a lot, but there are some incredible innovations around the world that are helping us extend or introduce longer time cycles into the way we make political decisions. And we urgently need that if we're going to be the good ancestors that future generations deserve.
Williams. Jane, would you like to introduce your book?
Thank you, Graham, and thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute today. Yes, my book, Future Gen, Lessons from a Small Country. The country is Wales. And I think that if I'm going to describe the book in a sentence, it is the story of government permission to do things differently. And therefore, it's an opportunity for a new kind of democracy. And it actually starts back when devolution was granted to Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland in 1999. And along with that devolution, a very specific new duty was given to Wales. Wales and the first National Assembly for Wales, of which I was one of the original members, was given a duty to promote sustainable development in everything that it did. And I think, Graham, you and I met about that time as well. And what was extraordinary about this is that although there'd been a lot of interest across the UK in Agenda 21 and actually delivering on the Earth Summit imperatives, only Wales was given that duty. It didn't go to Northern Ireland and it didn't go to Scotland. And I, over my period of time as initially as the Deputy Speaker for the new National Assembly, and then as a Minister, both in education and in environment, sustainability and housing, spent most of my years there trying to deliver on this duty to promote. And I'm sure that most people on the call will know of the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we established that very early on as the tenet against which we wanted to deliver this new duty. But actually, it was really, really hard because politics is inherently short-term. It is not a systems-led approach. It is very easy to be overtaken by events. And therefore, trying to change a political system from that inherent short-termism and from that inherent partisanship to one where the new body, and it was actually the body in the context of the legislature as well as the executive, acted on sustainable development, was really hard. And what made it even harder was the fact that sustainable development was not defined and the duty to promote was not defined. So that although there was something that, people felt was inherently a good thing, there wasn't a mechanism to enable it to be delivered. So when I was given the responsibility for delivering it in 2007, it struck me that we had to take a very different approach. I got a political decision in terms of getting the cabinet, a cabinet of two parties, Labour and Plaid Cymru at the time, to agree to put sustainable development or to make sustainable development the central organising principle of government. And in doing so, I thought I'd cracked it, because after all, you think you get a cabinet decision, off you go. But I'm afraid it remained very clearly uncracked. And in fact, what became very clear was that a cabinet decision was not enough if people didn't understand what they had to do to change their behaviour. And that's what led me to do the work that subsequently became the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I felt it needed to be something that was the heart of government, a new value system for the heart of government. It needed to relate to, at the time I was thinking about the Millennium Development Goals, but of course by the time the Act came along, the Sustainable Development Goals were in place. So it needed absolutely to link to wider global goals. And very importantly, within it is also mandated ways of working. You have to think long term, you have to think preventatively. You have to think collaboratively. You have to involve people about whom decisions are being made in those decisions. And also you have to integrate your thinking around the goals. So what we have now in Wales is a set of goals, 7 of them, that actually condense the SDGs. We also have these 5 required ways of working, which means that all public services in Wales have to deliver on that. And in doing so, there is there for the what is this act all about, the goals, how, the mechanism for achieving the goals. And we're still in very early days on the legislation, but I think that in many ways it is the mechanism that will drive the outcomes rather than the goals. And I just leave you with this rather terrifying thought. When I was asked to write the book this year as the person who proposed the legislation, I found out that Wales is still the only country in the world that has a legal mechanism to deliver on the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, and the only country in the world that has a legal mechanism to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, when we think that 193 or thereabouts countries signed up to those goals in 2014, it begs a very serious question about whether this is to do with the size and flexibility of a country in terms of the way it can move, or whether it is a vision yet to come for those member states of the UN about actually what delivering on those sustainable development goals means. And I would just leave you with a very similar proposition to the one that Roman just gave you. The quote from John Rawls, "Do unto future generations what you would have had past generations do unto you." And I think politicians in particular are so important in consideration about what are the subjects that we look at, what are the points of view that drive our policies. And we just look at the difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump for a very clear example on that, on climate change. So politics has to be a force for good if we really are going to look after future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible to anybody?
For a second you were audible and then you disappeared. I think it might be worth trying to turn your camera off. Rowan, we can hear. I think we can hear you much better now. So we've just heard from Jane. Should we pass over to Becky just to introduce hers? And what I think we're going to have to operate without seeing you, I'm afraid.
That's a great mercy for everybody. So
you're coming through much more clearly there. So I'll pass over to Becky.
I'm happy with that.
Thank you. Well, there's so much to talk about already from those two contributions, but I want to start with a rather stark fact. Jane mentioned the US election, and I think that we really need to reflect on the fact that over 70 million people voted for a candidate who has time and again denied the science of climate change. He didn't win the White House, but 70 million is a big number. And, you know, this could fill you with despair. And for those of us in the climate community, the danger is that it will send us rushing to the sort of conclusion that James Lovelock reached over a decade ago, that we need to put democracy on hold to tackle the climate crisis. And James Lovelock was very explicit in his call to put democracy on hold. He likened climate change to a war. But this call for experts taking over is actually one that I hear surprisingly often, certainly in the climate community, amongst those experts, you know, not necessarily scientists, but policy experts as well. And there's a strong sense, in essence, that those with the knowledge and the evidence should take control. It's what the phrase I find really helpful is one that the social scientist Martin Hager coined. He calls it Cockpitism. This illusion that you can steer the planet the way that you might fly a plane. Putting your faith in those two pilots in the cockpit, pilots who are almost certainly white men. And those pilots are in the cockpit, they have all the information they need, they're in control, they have a dashboard of gleaming instruments and levers to steer us all, we're back in the cabin, right? To steer us all on the right flight path. So, I mean, quite aside from whether we should be using aviation metaphors to describe climate action, I think this is a really dangerous illusion. But I really have to emphasize it's a tempting one for many. Certainly many of the people that I work with who are absolutely desperate to get things done so that we can tackle the climate crisis. But I think that the job now is to strongly resist those calls to Cockpitism. So let me go back to that 70 million. I think those 70 million votes actually show us that we need better democracy rather than some kind of workaround or bypass to democracy. Because amongst those 70 million, there will be some who agreed with him about the science. We know about 13% of the US population don't accept anthropogenic global warming. It's about 5% in the UK. But those numbers are relatively small. Most of them just didn't find it important enough to let influence their vote. Essentially, they had other priorities. But I have no doubt, and all the evidence of the sorts of deliberative processes that I've been involved in demonstrate that if you give people the respect, the responsibility, the access to information and evidence, they would almost everyone would support the action that we need to tackle the climate and nature emergencies, because at the end of the day, no one is purposefully voting for 3 degrees of warming and the destruction of the natural world. So I think we need to look at those 70 million votes, and rather than demonizing 70 million Americans and plenty of people over here as well, we actually need to turn the spotlight on our systems of government and on our conceptions of democracy, and ask how we can make things better so that those 70 million are genuinely included and listened to. And that might seem sort of really obvious to those who think and write about democracy all the time, but it isn't actually obvious to those people working in the climate sphere necessarily. So let me leave you with 3 things that I think would start to do that, to build better democracy. And the first thing is more use of deliberation, actually genuine attempts to foreground the views and values of citizens. And I was really delighted to be part of the UK's Climate Assembly, which Parliament, to their credit, commissioned. And that brought together 108 citizens who were representative of the UK as a whole, and brought them together, and in the spirit of deliberation, gave them that access to evidence and expertise, the ability to question and to think, and then to develop their own recommendations. I mean, Climate Assembly was brilliant, but I'd have to say it's not all about sort of big and showy processes. I think, and hearing what Jane said about Wales, it's also about how you do that much more painstaking work of building in democratic accountability into government systems and parliamentary systems across the board, how you just do deliberation and participation as a practice, as a common practice. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is to make much more concerted efforts than we do at the moment to link these global challenges, link these huge and complex problems much more directly to people's lives. And I think there that people who might think of themselves as experts in this do need that humility to see that people are experts in their own lives, and that their lived experience is really vital evidence that we can use to build that climate action that we need to see. So it's not just a moral case, actually. It's not just saying, let's let people be part of this. It's actually a very practical case, that it's learning about people's lives, about their, the practicalities of their lives, and also their values, is the best way that we've got of building a climate strategy that will include and engage and motivate people. So I was really struck by something that you said in your introduction, Rowan, about this interplay between I think you called it the very particular, and these huge themes, like the huge theme that Roman's unpacked for us about how to be a good ancestor. So it's that, I think we need to sort of have a play between both those extremes of thought, if you like. And the third thing, and what I'll leave you with, and interestingly it hasn't been mentioned so far, is that I think if we're going to crack this, we need a much more honest conversation about where the money is and where the power is. For two reasons. One, because a lot of it doesn't reside in the hands of those 70 million, but also because we need to absolutely face up to the fact that a lot of the progress that we need to see on climate, on sustainability more generally, is blocked, sometimes very purposefully, by people and companies who think they will lose out from this transition. Future citizens don't have a vote. Actually, future companies who might benefit from the zero carbon transition, for example, have no representation in government either. So I think we need a much more honest conversation about power and vested interests. So I'll leave it there, but very, very interested to hear back from panelists and also to see what questions we get. There's so much to unpack here. Thank you very much, Rebecca. May I check again if I can be heard? Yep. Good, good. Well, just to start the conversation off then, I think what we've heard so far is three very interestingly interlocking presentations. Roman has given us what you might call a controlling metaphor for the whole thing, what you might call moral genetics, how we inject something into the bloodstream, how we approach, as it were, an immunology of the distortions and dangers that we now face. Jane has spoken very helpfully indeed about the political mechanism of this, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and about the risk of seeing environmental issues as a set of issues among others, a particular set of boxes to pervading ethos, a pervading set of principles and protocols for looking at the whole picture. And then Rebecca which is about the nature and robustness of democracy. I think the last point which she made about the uncomfortable questions about where power is located are key to any effective discussion here. If I can still be heard, I wanted to begin the discussion by turning to Jane, if I might. Hello, Rowan. Hello. Nice to be in touch. I'm particularly proud of what's been said about our record here. But Jane, you talked about the mechanism driving the outcomes towards the end of your comments. Would you like to expand on that a bit, just to help us see how that works? Yes, I think what was very clear in the 12 years that I was in the National Assembly, and 11 years of those in government, is that, in a sense, the way politics and the interaction with the civil service operates is on its own track. And I think that's true of all organizations. They have an inherent culture and ways of working. And when you join the organization, you adopt those, you are assimilated into those cultures and ways of working. And those very cultures and ways of working became a real difficulty in terms of trying to change the agenda to move away from the reactive responses that are always in the nature of the political process, but the forward-thinking responses that, in a sense, were left largely to the civil service to be delivering, so that they would inform ministers of long-term trajectories. But those long-term trajectories, I was quite surprised to find, were often very short-term in practice, in the sense they'd take you to at the longest length to the end of an administration.
a period of manifesto government. So what I was trying to do was to try and find a way of looking at institutionalizing a mechanism that would actually enable people to think differently. And that was the original proposition in terms of asking the civil service and the government to look at sustainable development as the central organizing principle. But we then tested that. We tested it through the Wales Audit Office to see whether it was pervading the whole of the civil service, and they found it wasn't. It was tested externally by a policy academic who tested whether the ministerial responsibilities were being delivered according to this new tenet. And they found not only were they generally not, but actually even me, and as a person who proposed it, I was definitely found lacking in certain areas, so that we were really, the dislocation between the rhetoric and the delivery was there. And that's why it became so important in the passage of the bill. And of course, I wasn't there by then. So I really pay tribute to those assembly members at the time, and particularly civil society, who informed those assembly members all the way through in terms of saying, we need a mechanism enshrined in law because it has to be understandable and it has to be a requirement. And therefore the goals and the mechanism now enshrined in law, people are still on a learning curve, as the Future Generations Commissioner will tell you, but the mechanisms are now there, which enables both the Future Generations Commissioner, the public services themselves, and the Audit Office, all to use those in terms of driving new kinds of behaviour more appropriate for current generations in thinking about future generations.
Thanks very much, Jane. I wonder if I could pass that to Roman, because if we're speaking about the bloodstream, and there seems to be a metaphor that keeps coming back, Jane's outlined one very powerful way of putting considerations into the bloodstream, into the general climate. Apart from those political means, where would you see the levers for bloodstreaming arising? Where do you see the points of pressure that we need to be pushing on?
I certainly believe in the importance of redesigning what democracy looks like, the kind of work Jane's doing. And I absolutely believe in what Becky's talking about, about challenging power and restructuring our economy, shifting towards circular and regenerative economies. But in terms of going back to the moral genetics, how do we get something different flowing through our bloodstreams? I think we can also go to something very personal, which is thinking about the actual nature of legacy itself. And there are different kinds of legacies out there. I think most people, modern psychology tells us that most of us, when we reach midlife, we have a kind of a desire to leave something beyond our own death, some way of keeping the fire of our own life still burning. But we can express that in very different ways. So, there's an egotistical form of legacy. So a Russian oligarch might want to be remembered by having a football stadium named after them, or the wing of the National Gallery, a very narrow form of legacy. I think a lot of us, like me, are very much into the idea of leaving a familial legacy. I've got children. I want to leave certain things to my children, whether it's the home I live in, or passing on religion, or other traditions, languages, and so on. But I think if we're going to be good ancestors, we need to think about leaving a legacy for the universal strangers of the future, something much broader than that, those tens and hundreds of billions of people who will inhabit the future. But in order to do that, it's a challenge, because Groucho Marx famously said, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? And I think a lot of us intuitively feel, yeah, I've got enough problems in my own life now. But our connection with the future is actually quite tangible, or can be made quite tangible, literally through the young people that we know. My daughter, if you've got a niece or a nephew or a young person in your life you care about, but in my case, a daughter, my daughter's 12. There's a good chance she'll be alive in the year 2100. And if she has children or grandchildren, they will live well into the 22nd century. Their future is not science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. And if I think about the world that they're going to inhabit, if I look out the window on my daughter's 90th birthday, if I do that imaginative thought experiment. You know, what world do I see? Do I see a world of, you know, 3 or 4 degrees of warming and 1 or 2 meters at least of sea level rise, which is our current trajectory, or do I see something different? And if you really embrace that kind of visioning, and we can do that visioning, that's something extraordinary about human beings. We are experts at the temporal pirouette. We can think on a scale of seconds and look at our phones, and then we can think about saving for our children's education or writing song lists for our own funerals. We are experts at cathedral thinking. Alminster in southwest Germany began in 1377. It wasn't finished till 1890. We can do this long-term thinking, but the bridge of something personal, you know, thinking about our own children and or young people we know living into the future, is a bridge to something more transcendent. Because I know my daughter, when she's 90, she's not alone. You know, she is embedded in a web of the community, the people that support her, but also the web of the living world, the air she breathes, the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. So going back to your question, Rowan, I think one of the keys to, I guess, grasping the possibilities of reinventing our moral genetics or cultural evolution is to go in through that personal sense of legacy, and then and take that as a bridge to something more transcendent.
Thank you very much indeed, Rowan. So let me develop that a bit and bring Rebecca in, because the two things that were left with me by your presentation, Becky, were first of all, the risk of what you called Cockpitism, and the risk behind that, which is that we fail to pass on to our children a genuinely democratic vision. Because if we think that there's always the possibility of a shortcut that goes around democratic practice, that's a pretty ambivalent legacy, to put it mildly. And that, the second bit of that, I think, is the question: how then do we create a really vigorous democratic imagination through our educational processes, making use, as Rowan, I think, has already suggested, making use of the intelligence, energy of a younger generation in thinking differently.
Yeah, well, let me, I'll dive in there. I mean, you asked, how can we create that really vigorous democratic imagination? And, you know, I'm not sure that we need to create it. I think it's there. I think we need to harvest it. You know, I'm trying to think of a phrase as memorable as Roman just said, that we're all experts of the temporal pirouette. That's so brilliant that I can't match it, but I want to come back to it because it's absolutely true. So, you know, we are all experts in our own lives, and we're all actually incredibly good at systems thinking. We might not use the sort of language of intergenerational equity and, you know, neoliberal capitalist systems, whatever that might be, but everybody has a sense of the society that they want to live in. They have a sense of moral purpose. It might not be the same as yours, but they have it. You know, and down to the very, very practical, we know from polling that people have, you know, really high levels of concern about what we're doing to nature and the climate. So I think rather than creating this imagination, it's actually a case of really genuinely listening, and then finding ways that we can build that listening in. And Rowan, you mentioned young people. I mean, you know, personally, I found the school strikers incredibly impactful, because it just made me think that I had been, you know, making excuses for the system we're in, that I'd sort of bent my language, to fit the kinds of people that I speak to, whether that be, you know, politicians, business leaders, or whoever. And the youngsters, I mean, I've got teenagers, the teenagers come along and in that classic teen way, they just say it like it is, right? It's the classic Emperor's New Clothes stuff. And that's what we need. And actually, they put that forward themselves. But we should actually be thinking about a system where people's views and values, particularly young people, particularly marginalised people, can really come to the fore. And you know, Jane's been piloting ways of doing that. You know, Roman's thought about this as well. You know, immediately I'd say lower the voting age. That's something that can be done quite easily. More use of deliberative processes, as I've mentioned already. But then the flip side of that is that if you're giving more voice to people and their own lived experience, it actually means giving less voice to, as I said, those entities who currently hold the power and influence. And that's the really hard bit of it, you know, what people, you know, if you do manage to get more people's voices into the debate, when that hits the established system of power and influence, there's going to be a fight, right? And generally speaking, the powerful interests win fights. And so that's, I'm really interested in how we can sort of be much more honest and purposeful about facing up to the real politics of this. You know, you know, I've seen it myself in the coal mine that's proposed in Cumbria, and you see the power play there. And I want to foreground that and really unpack it and saying, you know, and say what is involved in this decision for us, for our community, and for future generations. So it's how we institutionalize those kinds of discussions, which is why, as I say, the Wales experiment is so interesting. That's very important to hear, Rebecca. And I absolutely take your point that we're not talking about creating an imagination, but if you like, releasing it or going with the grain of it. And that raises for me all the difficult questions which we've been circling around about the route into creating and nourishing and releasing a consensus. I mean, I'll go back to Jane at this point, because I think to hear a bit more about the processes of popular consultation that were woven into the Welsh legislation, that might be of interest to others, because I think it overlaps with what's been said about the citizens' assembly model. It overlaps with the sense of letting voices be heard that wouldn't otherwise be heard. And I'd like to hear, Jane, how much, not only how that process was thought through here in Wales, but also what levels of conflict during that process arose in the way that Rebecca has envisaged. Jane.
Right, thanks. I'm afraid that the mechanisms for consultation were pretty traditional in the run-up to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. I think there is an advantage in a small country, which means that when people know there is a consultation in a small country, that news gets around very quickly. So in many ways, there is a lot of interest, particularly on things that matter to people's daily lives. But generally, it was actually the government consulting. I mean, every time that there was a new sustainable development scheme under the original model laid down through the National Assembly legislation, and therefore actually constitutional in the context of the establishment of Welsh devolution, it was very much the government consulting on, you know, is this the way forward you want to see on these issues? What was really interesting is the press have never been interested in this. You know, you'd have thought this big vision about Wales doing something different right from the very beginning. They've never been interested, because with the establishment of devolution, there was almost a political press that came and took up residence in Cardiff, and they wanted to report on politics and particularly politicking. And many, many times I tried to get them interested in a big picture idea, and they were never interested in that. So I think it's almost never been reported upon in Wales, which probably also helps generate why it's not been reported on elsewhere either. And of course, as part of that notion about how you get information out, There are consultation mechanisms, but I wish that Roman had written his book before I became minister, because I would have seized the citizens' assembly model, where the Japanese one in particular, where half of the assembly members dressed up in ceremonial robes and came from a time in the future. I think it's 2060, isn't it, Roman, in your book? And I just thought that is a wonderful way of freeing the imagination. And I think the point that Becky makes about imagination is critical. But just coming back to your direct question, I think the only time the consultation became wider was actually in 2014, when the government handed the responsibility for the consultation over to the voluntary sector. And therefore civil society engaged with very, very many more people. What was interesting was that was a Wales We Want exercise, which reflect the similar consultation that was going on across the world for the world we want, in terms of the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals. But what was enduring was the fact that every single consultation, whether it was done in a normal traditional way from government, or whether it was done by civil society or within communities, kept coming forward with the same outcomes in terms of the kind of Wales people wanted, the kind of Wales that was focused on communities, that was focused on local, that was improving well-being, whether that was physical or mental health, that was improving nature, that was tackling climate change, that looked at a small country having global engagement that was responsible, that protected identity, culture and heritage, that fostered equality, that tackled racism. And I think what's really interesting is all those sort of principles about equity, intergenerational equity, equity in the context of humans and nature, humans living in harmony with nature, always came back as key themes in Wales. So there is a strong appetite for sustainability in Wales anyway, that means that when this legislation was passed, it was passed on a multi-party basis, and it was celebrated in communities who now want to use it to drive good behaviour in their public services.
That's very illuminating, Jane. And I think the emphasis you've laid there on inclusion as part of the whole agenda, that reflects one or two comments I've seen coming up in the Q&A bar about the need to look at all our patterns of exclusionary power, not just, again, this as an issue in itself. And your remarks about the focus on the local. Becky, I wonder if you've got some thoughts, because you said something about linking it to lives. What are the, how should you put it, the kind of optimal scales on which we can do this? Because a small country, as Jane has said, is quite well equipped. A region, maybe. It's harder the larger you go, and yet the questions are global, they're not just local. And I wonder if you've got thoughts about, yes, the scale on which the civil society consultation and education process best works. You have experience firsthand of some of this. And yes, just you might like to think aloud about how the processes of civil society consultation best work in terms of that large and small units issue.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there was actually a really clear steer on this from the Climate Assembly. It's not something we asked them explicitly as a question, but it was an absolute running theme of their reply that they wanted climate action to be coordinated, to be managed at a pretty local level. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I was in charge of the group who were looking at, I mean, this is, very practical, looking at how you get to zero carbon in the home, essentially how you make people's houses warm and well insulated, and how you switch to zero carbon heating. And policy in this area has always been very nationally driven. There's a national scheme that sort of goes top down, and you can be part of it or not. and actually people's preference was very strongly for local strategies. I think partly for democratic reasons, that they wanted that sort of control at a scale that they were familiar with. But also for practical reasons, that that local areas know, they sort of have the warp and the weft of the place. They understand what it is to live there, what the issues are. And so I think that we need to, I mean, speaking from my own area of climate policy, we certainly need to be a lot more locally focused. But I think that, that I wouldn't, I think that needs to come with a clear sense of responsibility. So, again, in practical policy terms, I think, local areas should be given a lot more responsibility, a lot more freedom and, resources and so on, but they should also have a clear responsibility in terms of contributing to national climate targets. So it's not a kind of devolved free-for-all. It's a, we've all agreed as a society to meet this goal of net zero. So how can this be done? So you're devolving the means, but you are keeping a shared focus as a society, ideally as a global society, but certainly as a national society, about what those goals are.
Thank you. I think the discussion keeps coming back, doesn't it, to the inseparability of medium and message. The message that we want to underline about global futures is one that carries its own implications about how we do our political business, and the errors of scale and the misplacements of power that we're up against there. Roman, can I come back to you on some of that, and how you react to what's been said about scale, about the context in which we best address this, and about the kind of politics, the kind of political ethic that ought to sustain and animate us in this?
Sure. I think in terms of the political ethic, I think there's a useful metaphor which I draw in my book, which is the idea that we've colonized the future, that we treat it like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And as we've mentioned in this discussion, those future generations have no political voice or representation, and they are not here to block an Alabama bridge like a civil rights protester, or go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. So we need to think about ways, in a way, of decolonizing that future and enfranchising those future generations. I think about it partly, maybe because I'm Australian, the way that when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th, 19th century, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land. They treated the continent as if there were no indigenous people there. Of course there were. And I think while those struggles against terra nullius still go on, we also have struggles against tempus nullius. We see the future as nobody's time, a similarly uninhabited territory that's ours for the taking. So how do we give those future generations voice, representation when they're not here? I absolutely think that the localist approach is fundamental. Jane mentioned something I've talked about in my book, which is the future design movement in Japan, which I think is a really interesting model. The future design movement is directly inspired by the Native American idea of seventh generation decision-making, a kind of an ideal of principle of ecological stewardship. And I know in the Q&A, people have been mentioning indigenous knowledge. Here it is in action in Japan. And as Jane said, what they do is they invite local people to draw up and discuss plans for the towns and cities where they live, divide them into the two groups. Half of them are told their residents in the present day, half of them are told their residents from 2060. And as Jane said, when they're wearing these robes from 2060, they come up with much more transformative plans, whether it's healthcare investment or climate change action. This future design movement is not a plaything. It is spreading throughout Japan to major cities like Kyoto. It's being used in the Ministry of Finance, even being used by companies. And my guess, just thinking of Becky's the Climate Assembly UK, in some ways, when I read the report of the Climate Assembly, I wasn't part of it. So just reading the report, I saw there were some really progressive things. 62% of people changed their minds, progressive ideas around getting rid of fossil fuel cars. But on the other hand, from what I saw was that as a whole, the group wasn't willing to bring forward the date of 2050 to an earlier date for reaching net zero. My guess is if you'd use something like future design in the Japanese model, where people literally did workshops imagining themselves in the future, you may have actually come up with much more, or at least somewhat more transformative proposals, because that's what the Japanese example shows. It'd be interesting to find out. But I think things like future design should be rolled out across progressive towns and cities in the UK, used by local government in decision making. And I think that's one of the ways we create a truly long now civilization.
Can I just butt in really quickly to say you're like this, Roman, because one of the local citizens' juries around climate, the one in Lancaster, the citizens themselves were talking about this issue of future generations, and they realised that they were all, of the current generation, but it was important to recognise future views, and so they actually came up with the idea of drawing cardboard cutouts of people representing future generations. And when they were in group discussions, there was a cardboard cutout in each group, and when they were questioning the speakers, they decided to come up with a question that was spoken on behalf of the cardboard cutout of future generations. So that was a kind of relatively spontaneous example of exactly what you're describing. But it's very interesting that that came from the citizens group themselves. That's what they wanted, because they all recognise the stake they have in the future.
And can I just butt into the butt in to say that idea, of course, is familiar in indigenous cultures, where there's the idea, for example, a children's fire that's burning when people are making decisions, in Native American councils and stuff like that. And some companies also try and, in a way, do something a bit like the cardboard cutout. So the renewable energy company, Good Energy, they talk about future holders when they're having boardroom discussions. They're thinking about the shareholders, the stakeholders, but also the future holders. I don't know if they actually have a cardboard cutout or leave an actual seat, but there's that kind of idea in it.
Now that's really helpful, because I think, again, we're back to this question of what do we really mean by democracy? And if one of the things that's involved in democracy is always going on asking the question, who's not here or who's not being represented and needs to be, then this particular issue of climate crisis really, really does focus our minds on the crisis of democracy in our world, because it forces us to ask that question in a very particular way, who's not here? But back to the local and the immediate, and Jane, where do you see the Welsh process going from here on?
Well, I think just to respond first to the conversation we've just had, I think that the notion of the future being colonized is a really helpful way of understanding the problem. Where I would have a slightly different view from Roman on it is that I think it's being colonized deliberately by politicians. I think they are deliberately not taking the decisions that are difficult, and they're throwing those downstream. And if we're going to change this way of operation, we actually need to look at taking decisions upstream. Mm-hmm. So it's a total inversion of current practice, because by throwing decisions downstream, as Roman has outlined, by contributing towards the ecological degradation, contributing towards stores of nuclear waste about which people do not know how to act, contributing through the, I think one of the most iniquitous schemes that has ever been there politically, which is the private finance initiative that just loaded future generations with paying for our public services in a way that put massive amounts of money into private pockets. All those issues, they're deliberate. They're not they're not accidental. They are deliberate causation of problems for future generations. And I think that we have to somehow get that message across, that when governments don't take decisions they're actually stacking up further problems for the future. The fact that the UK did not take decisions on the back of the largest pandemic exercise ever undertaken in 2016 has caused some of the many problems that we're in today. The fact that we haven't tackled major issues around inequality has contributed to the UK also being fully involved in the Black Lives Matter movement and all those issues around statues. And of course, as Becky has outlined again and again so cogently, the issue around climate change is dwarfing everything else in terms of how decisions are being made. And yet, you know, we're in a situation where we have governments who might or might not make decisions on these things, depending on who else is in power elsewhere in the world, or what kind of relationships they want with others, not in terms of their own agenda in protecting future generations. So my hope for Wales is that actually the structures that are now in place, a Wales Audit Office that now has to audit according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and is still in the process of developing that, a Future Generations Commissioner who has the ability to both name and shame, as well as to document good practice and ensure that people across Wales can have access to the information about what is working, is helping drive better performance. And I think what's really interesting, Rowan, in many ways the most interesting element, is actually there are now major companies from the private sector knocking on the door saying, how can we get involved in this? And of course, the biggest opportunity there in the small country of Wales is through procurement. Is if all public services in Wales procure using the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, it drives a change of behaviour in the private sector as well. And I'm really seeing, there are some questions in the chat about, you know, examples of good practice. Now, there are many in my book. There are many in the Future Generations Commissioner's site for people to actually see. But I just thought I'd quickly highlight three. The first is that not only has the Welsh Government actually reduced the voting age, as Becky mentioned, but they've also outlawed smacking. They've also changed the law on organ donation, so there's presumed consent. They also have, and it's something that I led when I was in government, and this now means that Wales is one of the very best in the world at recycling. We've got to now go up to the reuse agenda and the refuse agenda rather than recycling. But we were the first on the Children's Commissioner. We were the first on charging on plastic bags. And so this is all part of a narrative that's been developing over many years. We've seen of a proposal for an extension to the M4 because that would have such major nature damage to ecologically important sites. We're just about to introduce a complementary currency to support local foundational economy. We've got public health running transport decisions in our major cities in terms of joining up the clean air debate. We've had the climate emergencies designated by both the government and the Senedd, which is leading to increased action on that front. So there are, and there is a new curriculum that fully incorporates sustainability, but I'm actually working with Teach the Future at the moment to look at just what else can go in to the curriculums in different countries in terms of making sure that people not only challenge and understand the big issues, but what are the skills needed to address those as well. So, and the last example I'd like to give is the most exciting land use proposal I know in the UK at the moment is a proposal in the South Wales valleys, Rowan, which you know really well, in the context of communities that have had so much done to them by government ever since, you know, the sort of industrial revolution, and those communities have been left behind by no longer producing coal, no longer producing steel, no longer producing iron, no longer quarrying, no longer producing copper, etc. And there have been so many opportunities that governments have tried to take, and none of them have really engaged with those communities. And then there's this amazing proposal called Skyline, which is about those communities taking control of themselves, having land passed to them in perpetuity, provided they deliver new opportunities linked to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that feels to me so fundamentally exciting, and that actually that kind of approach involves a leap of faith for governments. And I just want to finish on the idea that all governments should actually be looking at a leap of faith that improves outcome for future generations. And I would argue that leap of faith should be enshrined in legislation, because laws are enduring, whereas policy can be ephemeral in terms of change of political parties. But it doesn't need to be the Welsh law. It's about whatever law is appropriate in the context of different countries. And of course, in England at the moment, there is a proposal actually going through the parliamentary process for a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act for the UK, built on the Welsh law, but different for a larger country in different circumstances. And we're starting to see some of that in other countries across the world as well. And really, if we can look at law to protect future generations that is appropriate for countries in different ways, we can use that to help the democratic process about how those decisions are made to contribute towards that as well.
Thank you, Jane. That's a really helpful note on which to transition, I think, to some more extended discussion with participants, because what you've done there is to bring us back to the question which, as I say, keeps coming up, the nature of the democracy we want to see, and how the issue that we're looking at impacts on the nature of that democracy. You've talked there about government, in effect, knowing how appropriately to give away responsibility to the local level, because that's the level at which effective change happens. And that's not an easy message for government to hear, but I think it is built into a lot of what we've been saying this morning. So with that in mind, it's probably time to give some power to our participants here and ask for questions from the floor. Now, Graham, I don't know if you've identified questions you'd like to flag up at this stage.
Yeah, there's a interesting question which we've received a couple of questions from YouTube, so we can't invite those people to speak. But I want to kind of push you all, including you, Rowan, actually, on this one. Interesting one. We've had a number of questions which have been about the compatibility of democracy and capitalism, and about whether we need to recognise that incompatibility, and whether good ancestors need to be clearly anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and feminist in their actions. But at the same time, we've just received a comment about how the language that's being used in this discussion can be quite exclusionary and can be seen as very left-wing, and very those people with less liberal views might find themselves exclusionary. So there's a really interesting tension here about, going with what Rebecca was saying around the need to sort of call out power and money, but at the same time that this language and agenda is one which is an inclusionary agenda. They seem to be in contradiction with each other. So I'm interested I would be interested to know that those were sort of seem to come from different spectrums. So I'm kind of interested to on yours and the panel's response to that question. And then maybe we can bring someone in from the audience to ask a question.
Thank you. I wonder, Rebecca, if you've got any thoughts immediately on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been looking through the questions, and Graham's right. There's a lot of, do we need to redesign our democratic system from scratch? And also, is capitalism compatible? And I have a lot of sympathy with those arguments. And, I definitely think that we need to be thinking long and hard about the model of capitalism, for example. But then I also flip back to, before my academic role, I spent 20 years at the front line actually working with government, both in an advisory capacity and a more sort of advocacy campaigning role, and so for me it always comes down to, what do we do today, what do we do tomorrow, in order to bring about those big system changes if we think they're necessary. So one useful way I find of thinking about that is what actually the pollster Deborah Mattinson calls symbolic policies, which are very practical policies which do things in the here and now, but but also articulate a vision of what we actually want as a society. And she gives the foremost example of a symbolic policy is actually Margaret Thatcher's right to buy council houses, because in that one practical policy, it articulated her vision for a society. Now you can like it or hate it, but it's very, very clever from that point of view. And I'm almost obsessed with this question of what are the symbolic policies for climate? What are the symbolic policies for future generations? And so that brings me on to this kind of left-right point, because I absolutely don't agree that climate or inclusion are left-wing issues. I think they are political issues, and I think there are different strategies for them on the left and right. So far, the left has, I don't think it's, my comment on it is that the left has spent more time articulating their vision. For example, the Green New Deal, which is an explicit left vision, especially in the US, is a left articulation of how we tackle the climate crisis. I haven't seen as much concerted effort by right-wing politicians or political thinkers to articulate a political strategy which is compatible with the climate goals that we have to reach. I think it's there for the taking. I can see the ingredients of it. I get cross with people on the left who say that you absolutely, that the left way through is the only way through. But I think that discussion is only just starting to happen. And hopefully it will happen more here now, because we have a government who's, very committed to the net zero target, and will need to, within the next year, needs to articulate that, right? So, I'm watching this one really carefully, but I would actually like to see more debate between left and right about how we meet these overwhelming challenges of climate, of inclusion, of, the crisis in capitalism.
Thanks, Becky. Roman, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think in order to explore or answer that question or the tensions between democracy and capitalism, we need to look at the history of both of them. And certainly over the last few hundred years, we see that representative democracy and sort of our individualist consumer capitalist model have developed hand in hand. And they've continually reinforced each other. So governments have been addicted to the idea of constant GDP growth, expanding material consumption, whether they are Keynesian or neoliberal or Marxist. They've all had the same kind of approach. And so these things have gone together. And we have to remember that representative democracy and consumer capitalism developed in the Holocene. They developed in a different age, right? When it was possible, perhaps in the 18th, 19th century, to pollute rivers and decline and diminish fish stocks while still feeding people, while still living in a world that was kind of ecologically okay. But now we know too much. We are now in the Anthropocene, and we are no longer in an age where the short-term cycles of representative democracy and the short-term vision of neoliberal capitalism are compatible with the fact that we have pushed ourselves over planetary boundaries on CO2 emissions, on ocean acidification, on soil degradation, all these things. So the big question we have to face is a very stark one, which is that these fundamental institutions, representative democracy, consumer capitalism, are no longer, they're beyond their sell-by dates, right? We need to reinvent. And that's what the whole rise of citizens' assemblies has been about. That's what the whole rise of the regenerative economy, circular economy movements are all about. They're trying to shift us into a new kind of democracy and a post-capitalist age. And that's absolutely fundamental. And, I used to be a political scientist in the 1990s. And, I was apparently an expert on democratic governance. And it never once occurred to me that we disenfranchise future generations in the way that other groups have been systematically excluded in the past, slaves, women, and others, of course, in slightly different ways. But if you really embrace the idea that our politics and our economies should respect the welfare of those future generations and not discount them away the way that the Treasury does and businesses do, governments do around the world, if you do that, then you must accept fundamental system change. And I'm not saying it's easy to get, it happens incrementally, it's very difficult, but if you're going to bring those future generations into the room, going to have not just one cardboard cutout of them, but billions of them, in our vision, then we cannot continue with the kind of system that we have. But luckily, can I say one more thing? And I know this is a long answer. I tell you where my hope lies. The fact that in the 18th century, people like Adam Smith didn't even realize there was an industrial revolution going on right in front of them. They couldn't see it. It was too contingent. It was too fragmented. And I think we can have more hope than you might imagine today, because there are these movements emerging, whether it's Future Generations bill in Wales and the one in the UK, the stuff happening in Japan, the regenerative economy movements around the world, Amsterdam committed to being 100% circular by 2050, 50% circular by 2030. There's stuff going on. Join those all together. There is a time rebel movement in action.
Thank you. Jane, quick comment from you?
Yeah, I think I want to be much more prosaic about this, in the sense that every single major decision that I was able to take through my role as a government minister, I always had at least one other party on board. And I think that when you're talking about the really big issues, that actually you've got to find your way through the partisan politics. And though we've seen both messages in the chat, and Becky mentioned how many votes Donald Trump had, what is also really interesting is that I did an event with Harvard, because I do some regular work with Harvard anyway, and I did an event with Harvard to launch my book in the USA. And I ended up in a conversation afterwards with a young Republican activist. And he said that he couldn't have the conversation inside the Republican Party around climate, but that all his age group in the Republican Party did understand that climate would affect their lives. And I think so it's a question of, can you find a different way of describing an opportunity? And what's been really interesting to me in the context of the launch of Future Gen is because I haven't in the book looked at the politics, I've looked at the political processes. So I've tried to lay out a manual about how you can actually deliver a set of outcomes in a non-political way using political processes, which means that actually I'm getting all sorts of interest from people who are also in more authoritarian regimes. And I'm finding that future generations, taking the points that Roman and Becky have both made, that future generations in the context of understanding our living experience of future generations, you know, whether in my case, that's my 90-year-old mother and my 3-year-old grandson, and realizing that between them, they will be 2 centuries. And she remembers cars coming onto the streets, sort of thing. So, you know, when we're looking at that lived experience and what we are potentially either condemning or hopefully not condemning future generations to experience, that is a breakthrough in terms of had people being able to have these discussions, which they could not have otherwise. And I think that actually, you know, what fills me with enormous amount of hope is that our generation are failing, and we have failed, but actually the next generation is much less likely to fail because they understand the big issues and they're going to affect their lives in a much more immediate way than ours. So I think if there's a way of both passing on the baton, but continuing to hold inaction to account, we actually can bridge that partisan divide. It's not as partisan here in the United Kingdom. It's not as partisan as it is in the United States in many countries. But I think you must give everybody a great deal of hope that even within a tribe that supports a president who has spent his whole time denying action on climate change, we actually have potentially a powerful group of young people who will want to see future Republican presidents act upon this. So we need to build upon the ways in which we can take these forwards. If I add my left-wing bias, of course we need the revolution as well, but but I seriously do think that actually, you know, the things that we want for tomorrow, we need to act on what we can work with today. And that is bridging partisanship around an agenda that can have resonance with more people.
Thank you, Jane. Just a very, very quick comment from me before we move on. I think a lot of the comments already have helped me see what there's a lot of evidence for around at present, which is that in all kinds of ways, some of them worrying, some of them encouraging, the left-right division is looking much more confused than in most of our younger days. What constitutes left, what constitutes right, what are the markers? I'm not sure that the kind of classical left-right polarity that I grew up with really maps onto political reality in lots of the world at present. And that's just something I keep reflecting on. It's important to recognize, as has been said, the potential ally voices in people who are not necessarily part of the tribe. I've been doing a bit of work recently on political tribalism, and this is all grist to the mill there. Second thought is, yes, absolutely, on the incompatibility of consumer capitalism as currently understood with a viable and sustainable future. At the same time, as we've been reminded, there are voices and agents in the private sector who do understand the issue and who are crucial and potentially transformative allies if we know how to work with them. And I think that's also to be factored into this. Graham, other questions coming?
So just on that theme, Rowan, there's a couple of points being made about one of the targets for strategic action needing to be social media and how social media shapes our politics. And I'm kind of interested that, you know, the panelists and yourself have been talking about these other ways of doing politics, but a lot of our politics is structured at the moment by social media. So is that, for people who are worried about future generations, worried about sustainability, has that got to be a target? That seems to be an issue two or three of the questions have been tapping into.
Thank you. Well, let me start with Roman there. Thoughts on social media and its use?
Sure. I think we're like children just learning to crawl or walk when it comes to social media. At the moment, we've allowed social media to be colonized by the short-term mindset, the age of digital distraction, the fact we're looking at our phones on average 110 times a day. But it doesn't have to be that way. So for example, something really funny happened the other day. I was giving a talk and I was suggesting that instead of having a buy now button, we ought to have a buy later button. So you press the button and then a drop down menu comes and you can buy now, but you can buy in a week, or an option to buy in a month, or buy in a year, or borrow from a friend. So if you press buy in a year, you know, you get an email in a year's time saying, oh, do you really want to now buy that third yoga mat? And interestingly enough, the day after I said that, someone sent me a website that they had just invented called mindfulcart.com. They are developing an app to do exactly this, to kind of hack into Amazon or wherever it is. So, but I think there's something very real there about trying to see technology as a tool and not as a fait accompli in the way that it is currently used or currently owned. So I think there's one issue there. The other one that I'm still a little skeptical of, but a little bit hopeful, is that the role of virtual reality and augmented reality in enabling us to imagine future worlds. So for example, in Stanford, there's a human interactions VR lab where you can literally have an experience of watching a coral reef die before your eyes over a period of 100 years. So you are, you sort of feel it and you hear it and you see it. And this is about, you know, trying to get people to step into the positions of future generations. And I don't think that technology is yet well developed enough or cheap enough to make it spread. And you know, I think rather than, you know, just watching a coral reef die before your eyes virtually, it's probably you're going to learn more by being in a real coral reef, but you don't want to fly there. So maybe just visiting an ancient tree and getting a sense of deep time through that might be a more low carbon way to do it. But I think we need to try and embrace technologies and use them to try and help us in a way communicate with future generations and the living world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jane, thoughts on social media?
I think it's what's really interesting about social media is the is that it's a bit like television in the United States. you can pick your value system, and then your life on social media reflects your engagement with that value system. And that is great in the sense of reinforcing on a daily basis, the idea that what you're doing, certainly in the context of, future gen coming in as a sort of unknown person into this world, it's great to have the reinforcement that I have on social media that about the ideas contained. But I'm also acutely aware that what this gives me is a very narrow view of the world and engages me with people who think like I do. And that's lovely in terms of your tribe, your elected and selected tribe, but it's not good to get a wider picture of what is going on in the world. And so I think that social media is a wonderful tool of getting your views out quickly, seeing other views out quickly. But I certainly have never found the way to navigate to those views which I know nothing about, because they don't come up in terms of the people that I engage with. So I do think, and the reason I compared it to the United States is that if you, I don't know how many people have ever have been to the United States at anywhere near an election, but I literally, my jaw dropped the first time I was in the United States at an election time and saw the hate ads that individuals and parties put out against each other. And they'd appear on specific channels. So if, just using that metaphor for a moment, if you were a Fox News advocate, and that's where you got your news from, you're going to have an incredibly different view of the world than you would if you were a CNN advocate. And I think that we just have to be hugely conscious all the time that what we see in that social media engagement is a tiny sliver of reality, and it's a reality that we're creating for ourselves. And I think there is something very dangerous within that as well, because of course, for those of us who believe we're trying to do something for a greater good and not for any personal gain, that's one element. But of course, on the same way, there are all sorts of people who feel that society has let them down so badly that they want to take an entirely different, radical, maybe violent, maybe antagonistic response to what they're feeling. And there's a huge challenge in the sense of how does democracy enable people to find a place and believe in it when you could have such different and polarized views. So I'm just I think social media is a fantastic proposition. I think it's great. I love engaging with it. I don't like the tyranny of it. I don't like the selectivity of it. And I think that we all need to learn how to engage more widely. And that's critically important for the survival of democracy as a way forward.
Thanks, Jane. Becky, quick thought?
I mean, nothing to add on the sort of filter bubble effect, which is very real. We all see it, don't we? I mean, I love climate Twitter, but they're my friends, right? They're really useful for that. But you can't be fooled into thinking that they're in any way representative. We've been bashing our democratic system, but I actually think that the Westminster arrangement of MPs representing a constituency is actually a really good thing for that, because MPs have direct daily or weekly contact with people in their constituencies, and they tends to be the ones who are struggling who come to see them, and that's a really good sort of ground truthing for MPs. It's not perfect, because obviously if you're I know Theresa May famously liked to hear from the voters of her, very leafy, very rich Oxfordshire constituency. So, she didn't necessarily have a sense of the country, but they do have that daily contact with people's lives. But I think at the end of the day, there's there is, and I'm very conscious of the time and how we're speaking today, but there's no substitute substitute for people in the room actually meeting in real life. And there's an amazing experiment in the US, which I'd really recommend you looking at, called America in One Room, where they brought together 600 US citizens, and they spent quite a few weekends together. And the main finding was from that is that, you know, a lot of Republicans spoke to Democrats for literally the first time and vice versa. And over the course of their discussions, actually everyone's views sort of went towards the center. Now you can say that's a good or bad thing, but it's very interesting how what people really got from that was how much they valued actual real-time exposure to people who thought differently to them.
Thank you. I think that last point is a crucial one. It's one I've sometimes tried to express myself in terms of the recognition that the people you disagree with are not going to go away. You know, you will have to find some way of negotiating a shared world with them. And one of the difficult things about social media is you can kid yourself that other people have gone away or will go away, but they won't. Hence the importance of face-to-face encounter. Hence, I would say, the importance of creating in our educational institutions genuine opportunities for face-to-face exchange, debate, and so forth. And that's, again, where models of citizens' assembly and so forth become so significant. But I think we've probably got time for one more round of questions and responses. So, Graham?
I'm going to try and be technically adept here, which is probably going to be a disaster, and ask a couple of people to ask their questions themselves. Let's see. Should we see? We'll see how this goes. And I wanted to call on Francis Volker and Ben Gallant just to ask a couple of questions, and then for you to take them in whichever way you want. So Francis had a number of questions, but one was about these spaces, creating these spaces, and about elected representatives. So Francis, did you want to ask that question?
Yes, I think I did put a few questions in. I said, please comment further on the need for improved democracy, perhaps some form of proportional representation, as fairly successfully managed in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but for no good reason Westminster thinks the English are not capable of it. And then citizens' assemblies are strongly resisted by some elected reps who consider that having been elected, they should make the decision in a cabal and not take instructions from their electorate. What do we need to do to change this attitude?
And Ben has a very different question around Roman's comment about inheritance and as a public and thinking about that as a public and communal good, but I'll let him explain.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so it was just reflecting on a comment Roman made about getting to a certain age and feeling the need to pass something on to future generations. The thing we need to pass on is a public or communal good, and I think we tend to think about inheritance in personal terms, usually financial terms. I was just thinking, especially since we can have quite a, relatively speaking, large effect on that personal financial good, but only a very small effect on that larger climate issue. How do we change people's thinking in relation to inheritance? My thought was it maybe relates to trust and trust in public institutions, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Thanks very much, Francis and Ben. I wonder if, Becky, you'd like to have a go at Francis's question about, if you like, the nuts and bolts of the electoral system and what ought to be done or could be done.
Yeah, I mean, on, you know, whether PR would make a difference. I mean, you know, I think you can argue it both ways. As I mentioned just now, I think there's something quite grounding in the constituency system, but then first past the post disenfranchises a lot of people. So, you know, and so sort of limits trust in the system. I mean, I come back to my very practical point of, you know, I can't wait for electoral reform to tackle climate change. So I really think it's a debate worth having, but we need to get on and do things in the meantime. On your second point, it's really interesting. When I was having discussions in and around the Climate Assembly, we do get pushback. We had that direct pushback from MPs. You're absolutely right. They said, I was elected to represent you know, to represent my constituents. And so, you know, I am the democratic process, me and my colleagues, and we don't want to sort of set up rival bodies like the Citizens' Assembly. The way I tend to look at this is that it's not about replacing representative democracy, it's about making it work much better and getting better social intelligence into the system. But I absolutely think that, you know, Parliament should remain the sovereign as it is in our system. I think it's absolutely right that it should be, but there's lots and lots of ways of improving the ways that politicians get that evidence and the way that they make their decisions. And interestingly, actually, I mean, anecdotally, we had some very sceptical MPs who were dragged into the Climate Assembly process because they were in and around the select committees who commissioned it, who started off by sort of paying lip service and ended up complete converts, actually. So it was really interesting to see in real time that they were actually picking up the value of these processes and actually ended up, you know, as sort of almost evangelists for them.
Thanks. Roman, do you want a word on Ben's question?
Sure. I think inheritance is a really fascinating topic from many perspectives. From the perspective of behavioral psychology, here's something really interesting I found when doing research for my book. If you ask people in the UK, you know, most people in the UK, on average, 6% of people will leave a charitable gift in their wills. So a bequest to future generations, people or planet or donkeys or whatever it is. So that's 6%. Now, if you ask people explicitly, would you like to leave a charitable gift in your will? It suddenly jumps from 6% to 12%. And then if you also ask them, if you say to them, a lot of people leave a charitable bequest in their wills. Is there a cause that you feel passionately about? Suddenly it jumps up to 17%. So with just a few little nudges, we can switch on this sort of long-term part of our brains. And though I'm not saying this kind of behavioral nudging is the solution to all our problems, but it is interesting to think about how we can be nudged along the lines of rethinking inheritance in a very practical way. But I think there's a larger question there about trust and law, really, and inheritance. I just want to mention here a really important US public interest law firm called Our Children's Trust, who have filed a landmark case against the US federal government on behalf of 21 young people campaigning for a clean climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Now, this is a landmark David versus Goliath legal struggle for doing something that hasn't really been done since the French Revolution, the idea of giving rights for people who may not be born for decades. But this movement is influencing legal cases around the world, in Uganda, in Colombia, in the Netherlands, the Urgenda case. And all of these are trying to use law and often the idea of a public trust, the idea that we are stewards, you know, and we are borrowing the future from our children. We need to pass on the atmosphere. We need to pass on the oceans. And we have a kind of a legal duty to do that. And somebody mentioned in one of the earlier questions, I think the idea of ecocide, you know, having an international law around ecocide. And again, that is moving forward in France and other countries. There's a long-term struggles, but I think that the legal mechanisms, as Jane was mentioning, and also Becky was mentioning, those legal mechanisms are really fundamental for bringing a notion of public trust into political and policy decision-making. And actually, I've said that really badly. Actually, the point is, it's not about policy, as Jane was saying, it's about something longer term. It's about, you know, law as something that can transcend short-term electoral cycles and policy cycles. And that's really fundamental. So there need to be these legal struggles going on, but they'll be different in different countries, depending whether you've got a written constitution or not, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Jane, very quick comment, if you want to add anything to those.
Just two quick things. I mean, I think when we see systems failing, we often try and find a magic bullet to make them better. And, you know, democracy takes so many different forms. And although personally, I think that the first past the post system has a lot of problems in it, and I really like the fact that as mentioned by Francis in the question, that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, in their new iteration as devolved nations, have a combination of first past the post and the list system. so that you actually marry both systems. And I think that the idea that votes are given and useless is something that does need to be addressed in political systems. But I also think that this point about trust is absolutely critical. And I think what's been really, really interesting in the context of decisions in the UK over COVID is that you've seen very different decisions in the devolved nations to the UK government, which for the purposes of COVID is an English government, because the health system is actually devolved to the other nations. And you've seen very different perceptions of trust in leadership in the 4 countries in the UK in managing this particular crisis. And trust enables politicians to take more difficult decisions. And if they lose trust, it becomes much harder to make those decisions. So I think that I don't think we should worry on the basis, as Becky said, we're not going to change these political systems overnight. So let's work with what we've got. But actually, there's a really important point about ensuring there is trust in the system because of the way that people behave. So I think there is a fundamental obligation on politicians to behave in a way that enables the populace to trust them. And that's across all parties.
Thank you, Jane. I think we'll all take away that phrase about what trust enables, enabling politicians to take risks, in effect. Because we have politicians who don't take any risks. We have a completely static public realm. People will only take those risks, make those innovations, if there's a sense that the people who vote for them, trust their instinct, their imagination, their intellect, and are prepared in a representative system to believe that will work. So quite a challenge there. And I think one of the subtexts also is, are we actually learning anything about all this from the COVID crisis? Because there ought to be somebody out there taking notes, as it were, on the specifically political lessons we're learning about trust, about devolution, about the processes of decision making, all of which are relevant, I would say, to our main topic today. Well, we've just literally hit 1 o'clock, so people will need a bit of a break. But let me express on everyone's behalf enormous gratitude to 3 wonderful panelists who have opened up these questions in such an exemplary way, with so much specific detail, so much vision and excitement and energy. Thank you, Roman. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Becky, for a wonderful morning. Really delighted to be part of this. And Graham, back to you.
Yes, yes, and thanks from CUSP and from FDSD. That was really great. I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, we had an immense amount of questions, some of which we just simply couldn't get to them, and we hope to persuade the panelists to maybe offer some short responses to those that we weren't able to get to, and send those to registered participants and publish those on the CUSP site as well. They will, of course, refer extensively to their own books, but you know what authors are like. Secondly, to remind everybody that there is a session this afternoon. Oh, they're showing each other's books. That's good. Oh, Becky's showing her own book. That's terrible. There is a session this afternoon on nature writing and the common good, where some of the writers who have been part of the CUSP project will be presenting their work, and there'll be a discussion with Louisa Adjoa Parker, Madeline Bunting, and Jessica Lee. If you're interested in that, you'll need to go to the CUSP website. It's a different link. This link is not the right link. And finally, and once again, I'd like to thank Rowan, I'd like to thank Roman, I'd like to thank Becky, and I'd like to thank Jane. That was a really creating and stimulating session, and I wish you all a good lunch. Thank you very much.